Hello, everybody. Thank you, Salomé, for inviting me for this summer school. It looks extremely interesting, also the research, and I think the lecture was also for me a good learning. So thanks for that. I prepared a presentation for today. I tried to orientate a bit around Earth, but also reusing material. And I called it Cultivating the Metropolis, which is also a bit of a mirroring gesture on like what you are now working on in the context of the Rurapolis. The idea of it is also very linked to the practice I'm doing in the Netherlands around the question of how can we build cities and how can we rethink them together with like this urban flow of material that we're getting constantly and that we cannot store in the city. How can we build with it? How can we also give place to that in the city? So I'm gonna start on presenting. I'm Estelle, I'm an architect. I come from France. So this makes more sense now. So cultivating the metropolis, that's so I'm a French architect. I'm working in the Netherlands since a couple of years now. I studied and I grew up in France in a pretty rural area next to Lyon. And there, of course, the tradition of earth building, but also stones and wood building is very present. And still nowadays, I think, still very contemporary for a lot of projects. And when I moved to the Netherlands, I got a total different approach on architecture. But also, it brings me to question the question of standardization in architecture. How come that we are now working with so many standard material, and where is the freedom, but also how can we relate somehow to more sustainable way of building. So that's probably also what brought me back to where I came from and questioning what can we do with natural material while in the city. Natural material are not so much there, so obviously the urban mind is much more interesting to study. So I'm having my practice in Rotterdam. I worked as well before for a bigger company, on larger scale projects, and as well on workshop, making furniture, but also making small scale building. So somehow I'm combining a bit everything in my practice, and I'm trying to orientate it more towards research and design by material. So that's also what I'm going to try to explain in this presentation. So I think the idea of learning by doing is also very important, and I think it's also important in a way that we need that in order to teach ourselves as architects and to learn new way of building with those urban mind material or more vernacular. But at least by learning by doing, it helps us to question the detail and question the resource. How do you get the material? How do you connect them together? What kind of low-tech or high-tech way could you find to build those assemblies? So on the screen you can see two of the projects in building phases. As also this important idea that you don't design only in front of your computer, but you also design when you're making stuff, so on site. In the presentation I also want to talk especially about this project, but since the Rurapolis idea, I thought it's nice to briefly talk about this one, Cultivating the Metropolis. That was a small research statement made for a prize in the Netherlands. And during this little research came also this question of what place do we give in the city to store those material that we collect. So we demolish constantly, we build, we demolish, and there are like large landfill of rubbish, material, rubble, earth, and all these things somehow is disappearing from the city. So when we demolish, we bring stuff on the surrounding, and we don't let it anymore at the view of people, to be able to know what do we have, what is actually our material storage or material capacity. So there was also this research on thinking how could we somehow in the city re-implement these landfills as more productive area where we can build, when we can source material, and maybe you can, by doing that, also diffuse a bit more know-how and techniques and invite people to learn from those materials. This was also very interesting because in Brussels, for example, the policy of the municipality is somehow to invite the productive area within the city center, within the new developments. As in many cities now in Europe, the idea is still to keep the productive city, especially in France, to keep it productive, the industrial area really outside the city as like surrounding. So I think that's a very open question, but it's still interesting to think about it as architects. What do we give as space to this productive place? Because somehow we need them, they have important social and economic impact, but they also display what we are transforming, what we are doing, also what kind of pollution are we doing. So that's also interesting somehow, I think, to question it. And maybe to just finish up a bit, just really on the practice of the studio itself, I think that's also questioning how to build this material and how to, on each project, introduce them, research them in simple assemblies and so on. And I think this research somehow started by a sketch model, but also by a sort of detailing model, which helps you as a sketch model to think those details and to think this material as like what can you do with it and so on. Yeah, so I will continue with the special research we're doing. So not only the studio, but also together with other people. George is here tonight, so we collaborate together, and two other friends of us, we are working on this project on in researching the Earth's resource in Rotterdam. What can you do with that? So Rotterdam is in the Netherlands. Obviously, the Netherlands is not known for like raw clay technique, but very much for the baked brick technique. So I'm not going to talk too long here about the bricks because it's not my specialty, but it's still interesting to think how do we research as an architect, how do we research this material, and how do we give them enough space in our project, but how do we also learn ourselves how to use them. In the case of Holland, what interested us is that there is a very large flow of clay that is being excavated and take off the sewage system of the city, so the place where the water, the grey water comes, there the clay is coming up to the surface. So because they have to renew the system, they take off the clay, and that means that we get a large amount of clay that needs to be stored, put in other places, can be under infrastructure, can be for vegetable soil. Anyhow, there are these big heaps of clay and ground and gravel that comes all the time out. So we decided to question that and to also, from our own background, what can we do with this clay? Because obviously Holland has a very wet climate, it's also extremely dense urban planning, so the question nowadays in Holland is how can we build 1 million or 10 million houses? So obviously the vernacular techniques are not looked so close because it's not giving, let's say, sufficient capacity to build fast, cheap, standard, high, and so on. But so, as a group, we decided to research that. This is a painting that shows a bit the Dutch culture, so the culture of making bricks that exists from the 12th century or so on, and probably even before. And it's interesting painting because it also shows that back then these techniques of baking brick was involving more than only, that was involving family, kids, women, men, and so on. So this is showing a bit the landscape view. This picture as well shows a bit this heritage of like this high factory with the chimney and also the traditional way of making bricks. And it's quite interesting because it's of course course, very close by to making adobe. And here as well, it's also interesting to look at what were the infrastructure that were linked to these baking bricks and used to really compose the Dutch landscape. This is an oven that is used to, once the bricks are dry, to bake them. This is probably one of the last ones because it's part of a museum, so it's more to show up the techniques than to actually do it nowadays. Of course, now the process is very much industrialized in making of the bricks. Here as well, it's interesting to see that this now also brought back these very strong forms of architecture, which you don't find anymore almost in Holland, because as well it has been industrialized, but also the production of the bricks has been drastically reduced. I put some number for you in the book, but it just gives an idea. Yeah, they said that in the half 19th century, there were more than 100 billion bricks that had been produced, which is the equivalent of 160,000 million cubic meter of excavated clay. So that gives some strong number, but it shows as well that clay has never been a problem in Holland. So the way we approach the problematic is, right, there is clay, but the traditional way of using the clay is to bake it. Baking it means that you cannot turn back the process, so that means that the clay gets like solid, and the only way to get rid of the material is or you reuse it as a brick, or you demolish it and turn it into gravel. But as soon as it's baked, you cannot change the state of the metal anymore. A little genesis of also those bricks. So of course the bricks technique started a long time ago in the north of Holland, and their bricks, they were back then made by monk. They had their own technique because also Holland is composed with mainly sea clay. So there is river clay, but there is also sea clay, and the example of the monk in the north of Holland is that they had the very special techniques of triangling along the bricks and then baking them to be able to use this sea clay as a building material. They were back then doing very tiny bricks, and then step by step the bricks growed, and then you see also that over time the function of the brick changed, so the brick was not anymore only structural, it became thermic, became also cladding, and so on. So, and of course nowadays the brick is probably mainly used as a cladding, still used probably a bit for structure, but the cladding is of course a more likely solution. There is also interesting to show all process of making bricks, and you see the direct similitude with how do you make adobe. The interesting thing as well is that if you take those kind of bricks, there is a big chance that if you let them dry long enough, they become compressed, or not really compressed, but dry adobe block. So if you would go to a factory nowadays and get a block, before it gets baked, it would still be, you could use it as a raw material. So it's also interesting that it's almost just cutting a piece of the process and then you can get the raw material. And yeah, another form, and that also shows that before the industrial process there was need for a lot of space in those factories. This is a very nice diagram of how many type of blocks inside you have. So there as well you can see that the baked brick has like a very long history, and it's also inspiring in a way to research material. And if you're orientated towards blocks, that the brick know-how, the baked brick know-how masonry has a lot to give to a more raw use of the material. Yeah, as well, so I talked about sea clay, but there is of course river clay. So the clay is used to be taken on the side of the river. So after the big flow of the river, the clay would stay on the side and it could be harvested and then used to make those bricks. So if you look at this, it's just a simple way to just explain it. But those layer of clay they were used to do bricks. And the interesting thing is that already back then the question of making bricks was also seasonal. So that means that only from April to September on the dry season they could do bricks because they needed time to let it dry outside. And so there was like already this cycle idea of producing material a certain time of the year. So here you see a map of the sea clay, the river clay, which is a little bit less of like separated because you can find river clay in the Netherlands and not only at the border. And then you see an old map of where all those factories were placed. So here you can see the evolution of the factories, and there was a huge number of factories, and nowadays there is only 13 factories left of bricks in the Netherlands. So you can also see the rotation of the production, which means that there also the landscape or the vernacular landscape linked to this industrial fabric has been fully transformed. So from this research and why do we approach it so theoretically and also so much onto the big brick is that not all regions in Europe or else have the same culture of the clay. And in Holland, the culture of the clay is to bake it. So there is of course a little bit of factor, like the timber, it's a wooden structure that you infill with type of bricks. There are many techniques. So you have a little bit of this technique in Holland, in the south of Holland, but it was mainly baked brick. So we approached this research in this matter because we thought that it's good before we bring this research further on to know what we're talking about and what is the state of the matter in the Netherlands. How can we also convince people that work with very standardized material that there is a real potential in raw clay form, which could be linked to compressed blocks, but we can also be linked to prefabricated routers, PCs, wall, routers floor, partition walls, and so on, plaster. That's the idea is to research all this material. But first we have to also translate a tradition towards new form of building. For this research, we got a support from the municipality of Rotterdam, but it's a very small support for now. So the interesting thing is also for us to bring attention to students, to architects, to local parties, which means public actor, but also industrials, developer, and so on, to be able to bring enough attention and to bring interest around this material, because if the interest comes, then eventually funding can come and then the research can go further on. So the interesting thing in Holland is that there is a very strong support network for the creative field, the architecture field, the innovation field, circular field, and so on. So we are also lucky in this matter that we can get step-by-step project and experiments and proof of concept to show that we can go further and we can carry it on. So for this matter, we also try to work with BC in Belgium, in Brussels, which help us as well with inputs on how to proceed, on knowledge and so on. So that's also interesting because they of course work very much in the same area. This is just a series of sample that you can see. The dark clay is the Dutch clay. And to bring this attention, it's also the idea to create mock-ups, so to apply to the project, but also to build small objects like furniture, to also catch up the interest, have a very easy piece to show, and it's also somehow a way to demonstrate what you can do with this clay. And also we do support exhibitions to try to demonstrate and show the materials, how it's been used, and so on. So in Rotterdam there is something quite interesting. In Brussels as well we have it a lot, but in Holland there is a concept called the grondbank, which is a bank of soil. And this bank of soil collects the soil-related material comes. And from them, they also start to organize it, because a lot of soil as well is being polluted in cities. So there is a large flow, and especially in Rotterdam, that is fully polluted ground, very heavy metal, so you cannot use it anymore. So it's soil that needs to be just buried in the ground. But there is a big part of soil which we use, and they already have this strong project of mixing soils to bring it to landscape needs. So if you need to put a garden, vegetables, farmers, and so on. And then they create their own mix of like a very fruitful ground, a mix of sand, clay, natural matter, and so on. So this is what you see on the picture, and of course they also have heaps of clay, heaps of sand, heaps of flames, which is for us fantastic. So we go there and we source a bit. We see that the material that comes is always different. We don't have yet a large flow that we can quantify and qualify and say, okay, from this you could build such an amount. So we for now work very, how you call it, in smaller samples size. And we try to organize workshop. On the left was the workshop with BC that we organized in Rotterdam. And then on the right we did the first experiments with Rotterdam soil, and the idea was to bring a few people together and get them try, see, understand how this material could be used. Yeah, so we see a little bit more pictures. So there are like some small tests, but also a bit of explanation, learning, and so on. So it was a learning by doing workshop. So we built a small footwork from a former exhibition in Rotterdam, and later on we rounded this in full. So the idea was just on a day to just understand and show what you could do with this material. Of course, there is part of the experiment that failed because it was raining a lot, so no surprise. And to continue a bit on this first research, last year we also started a studio at the Academy of Rotterdam, Academy of Architecture and Construction. And via this studio, we also introduced a couple of students, and we brought them to lead their own research on how to use clay in their project, and mainly raw material, and each of them took a different approach on researching the use of stone, the use of roots in it, the use of oyster crushed, and so on. And as much as for us, we also work with a local partner, which is OSCAP, and which is very interesting character. He's not only a machine maker, so he builds machines for Earth across the world. So he brought like machine to do bricks on sites in Africa, in Iran, and so on. So he's constantly traveling with this machine, and in the meantime he's producing main block, so compressed earth block, which he most of the time still stabilizes, but still while stabilizing it can still reuse them partially. So that's also interesting. And so we brought the students, so it's nice to show a picture of the factory. So he has a simple factory in the north of Holland, just a big hall where he has like all his machines, and there he produces blocks, but also plaster, mortar, and I think that's about it for now. And he sourced the clay in the Netherlands, so he has like a few sources for now, where he just gets clay out. So he still is excavating clay, and then he's transforming it to building materials. So here, the idea also for the students, and I think in general as architect, is to question how do we use materials. So what is the limits of the material? You don't need to be an expert, I think, but it's good to, by doing, find out what happens if you put too much hemp in the brick. So that was like the desire of the students, was to put a lot of hemp in it. And of course, the brick became super elastic and totally not useful. But that's also this specific moment that you need to understand what is your freedom and where are the limits of the material. And so after this research, there was like a presentation on it. It was so interesting to see everybody had some sample. And the idea was to research the project by the material. So to start by studying the material, the technique, choose one based on what is your local resource. So a lot of it's in your garden to take your own earth, great. And then they made their own samples, and step by step they built their own project. So this is an example of Judith. She did this research with oyster crush. She started with, I think, mussel and oyster, and then she sticked it to oyster. And so she was working on the wrapped earth recipe, which she did a model with it. The project was based on this technique together with roots. And in the meantime, she did her experiments. So yeah, so maybe to conclude, this research is ongoing research, but for us it's inspiring because it's also, we try to involve it in our project, we try to grow it within Rotterdam, and we try to bring this attention, because as soon as it gets enough attention, then you can get the necessary network to support a new technique or a new material. And I think in material research, that's also essential to bring that. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specific case. So this is a project that was done by the studio, building and building, rebuilding. It was first one building and then unbuilt and then rebuilt. So there was also good experiments to see what can you do with reuse. So you can reuse yourself, you can reuse from the city. In this case, it's a mix. It has been reused from the city first and then reused another time in the project. So by doing that, it's also for us a learning process to understand how do you quantify material, how do you design with leftover, with rest, how do you think a project this way. It's very small scale, but it's still essential to me to start there because it's a good way to learn. And if you work on a very big scale, you don't have this freedom and you have a lot of pressure on what you're going to build. In this case, the pressure is very minimal, so you can experiment the most. So at the studio, it's also about building self-building, which is also how to educate ourselves. So here you see the genesis of the project, the building, the rebuilding. So the first pavilion has been built beginning of the year. And the second project, the greenhouse, is currently in the building, so we had to put it on hold and we'll start again. So here you see the two volumes, the two projects. They have some similarity, but they also have their own language in the way that they use, of course, the same material base. So earth, wood, acrylate, steel roof. But they all try to propose different type of assembly. So as a research to think, okay, can we build such a catalog? Can we think of those new form of standard material, which are maybe very low tech, but based on urban land resources? So you see also the foundation is a very important topic, and I think very interesting as well. How do you connect? Especially if you want to do dry foundation system, it's something we're not so used anymore to do, but there are many ways to do it. Highway or with that. So this was the project when it was built. I'm going to scroll a bit through it. So on the right, it's also just to explain a bit how it's been built and what kind of material are composing it. So I said, I mentioned there are bricks, so blocks, not bricks, but cement blocks, let's say. Together with bricks, together with earth, a floor made of wood, a ceiling, which is also made of the same floor, the same wood as the floor, but in a different way. Acrylate, plywood, pine structure, which hasn't been reused, but is now reused, and a corrugated aluminum roof. So sourcing in the local context is also sometimes going through your local suppliers, so the local inhabitants that get rid of the materials. In this case, the bricks, they were collected, the bricks as well. Then the earth was built via a collective workshop, and the earth was, in this case, imported from Brussels. The idea was to do it from Rotterdam earth, but the research was not far enough at this time. So we decided to first build it with Brussels clay, which is just an hour and a half away, so it's not so far. And here you can see the workshop. We had a lot of fun. Here a little bit more detail. So that was the idea of assembling the floor, the base. Sorry. So behind this idea, it's of course we already knew that it was a temporary pavilion. So it was also helping to use the earth in this way, because it's normally don't use the earth for the bottom of the wall. But still, the earth was lifted up by a layer of stones, which were about 15 plus the slope, so 20, so it was not so bad. And it was sort of protected from the top. So the idea was to include detail of the floor as a formwork for building the wall. So you see a bit the bulk on the side. So this was the first part of the formwork of the wall, and that stayed in position after, and then the rest of the formwork was reused in the project and during the studio. The drawings, which are very pixelized, but yeah, that just to give the proportion of the project, and it's not so easy to see. And yeah, here are some pictures of the construction. So each material was a challenge as well. We're using plywood. How can you do it? How can you dry and assimilate it? So it was not glued. It was only used by glue by vinyl pins. So without glue, but just attached product. And here you can see that's the process of building it. So there was collecting first the plywood in Rotterdam actually, so really on site. Building it and using for the handle, using some leftover of the carpentry workshop that was next door. They had like a lot of nice piece of oak, so could have done 100 handles. And here you can see the acrylates, which was also interesting material, which I'm keeping using in the project because it's a very big resources in a way, because it's been taken out from chicken farms and greenhouses. So there is a lot of this material, and it's very rigid, it's very transparent, it's much stronger than polycarbonate. So it's a material that we can use in many ways. It's of course not insulation, but it can work as a greenhouse, as a winter garden. Like it could be really applied also on larger scale projects. So it's interesting to work with it. Yeah, so here you can see the component, the way they moved, and here it's very small to see, but there was also an exercise to say, okay, let's quantify, let's understand what quantity of material for each project we use, how is it being reused, in which project does it go, how can we sort of keep track of this flow, and also reintroduce this flow in different situations. Here the unbuilt materials stored and now on the way of being rebuilt. So for example, the bricks, they haven't been used as like a low wall, but they have been used as a load-bearing pavement within the wooden grids floor. So it's also interesting because it leaves the water goes through, and in the case of the greenhouse, because this is going to be a greenhouse, the water needs to flow, so that was perfect. And in this project, the idea is to experiment with prefabricated rounded stone tiles, which are going to come in the 8 square that you see on the screen. So that's also a way to reuse some part of the earth, and also there is a saying that, of course, for example, round earth, if you demolish your wall, you can rebuild with it. So it's also very interesting to actually do this step and see what does it mean. It means you have to crush it all, and then it's very much work, but it's possible. So if you have a machine, it's probably extremely fast. By hand a bit less, but it's still interesting. And yeah, so that's like a few pictures of where we're in the building. And for now, the building is in hold, and we will start soon in October when we get a bit more time. So this project was a project which is just finished to build and was made in Amsterdam for a charity association, and they wanted to have a garden house in their garden. And this garden room would become a working space, non-insulated, so it was also a very great opportunity to try to experiment again with those local material. So in this picture you see a very interesting wood, which is a tropical wood. This tropical wood, I will talk a bit later about it, but this is like a great source of structural wood in the city. So at the end it could